Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Invited Session 5, Antitrust. My name is Lorenzo Coppi. I am an Executive Vice President at Compass Lexecon and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges. I will be moderating this session. This session has two presentations, one by Giacomo Calzolari and one by Louis Kaplow. And each of the presentation will last about 40 minutes, and then they will be followed by around 5 minutes of questions and answers. As to the Q&A, please use the Q&A facility in your Zoom viewer. That will deliver to us the questions, and I will select and relay them to the speakers after their presentation. So without any further ado, let me first introduce our first speaker, Giacomo Calzolari, who's professor at the European University Institute in Florence and previously at the University of Bologna. Giacomo has written very many papers in several areas of IO and beyond, including on banking, trade, and regulation. Particularly, he has a long-standing interest in competition policy, hence his participation today, and I particularly direct you to his AER and IGIO papers on discounts and exclusive contracts. However, today he will be talking about a different topic, which is algorithmic pricing and collusion. Giacomo, the floor is yours.
Thanks to you, Lorenzo. So let me here we are. So let me start thanking the scientific committee of this year conference, Leslie Marks, for this invitation. And I also want to give a great thanks to the local organizers, Luca and the group of people in Bologna who worked for this conference. I know by direct evidence that they were preparing a memorable conference. And unfortunately, we were not able to join all together in Bologna. But still, here we are. This is it. And at least I hope that in the future, next year, we will have the opportunity to meet together all together in Bergen. And before I start, I also want to thank the group of co-authors for this research, Emilio, Calvano, Vincenzo, Denicolò, and Sergio Pastorello. I was lucky enough to start discussing with them when I was still at the University of Bologna. And working with them was really enriching for me. It was a great pleasure and it was a great fun. So guys, I know that you are attending this conference, this talk, and so you are also responsible to answering at this point after this praise to the difficult questions. But really, thanks a lot to this great group of co-authors. So the talk is going to be about algorithmic pricing and collusion and more recent results that we are obtaining. Essentially, the idea is that we have studied throughout the years the effect of algorithms that are used for pricing and that are powered by artificial intelligence. And we have a series of papers on this. The last two papers that you see here are papers that deal with more with policy implication. Well, today I'll spend more of the time on the analysis of the effects. So we started thinking about the simple observation that pricing algorithms are indeed populating markets more and more. So if you look, for example, in 2015, in Amazon Marketplace, more than 1/3 of the prices already by that time were set by bots, by the algorithms. And Amazon itself was encouraging the use of automation in selling and pricing activity as a source of value and efficiency. And I want to just pause a second here because the paper is going to be mostly on the fact that pricing, AI-powered pricing algorithms may end up colluding. That's a possibility we're going to show. But I really want to clear the table about the fact that we are not against the use of algorithms in market, which can be really a source of efficiency. Also, for this reason, algorithms are not going to be a temporary phenomenon. If you were traveling in Northern Europe, probably the price of the gasoline you're going to pay could have been set already by an algorithm nowadays. Now, so what is new about this? To some extent, not really that much, because algorithms have already been used since at least the 80s in hotel industries, airlines, financial markets. Also, the energy sector was discussed at length in the last talks at EARIE. So those algorithms were though fixed rules of behavior, where the programmer were hardly coding the behavior of the algorithms with fixed rules, with collections of what they call if and then rules. So those are the so-called expert systems. So what we are more interested here is the algorithms that are powered by artificial intelligence. And the novelty here is that these algorithms are model-free. You don't need to instruct that much to these type of algorithms. And they are also autonomously learning from experience. And if you were able to open up this type of AI-powered algorithms, you would see an objective function coded, which could be, for example, the profits, and also the information about what the algorithm should monitor in order to take actions. Now, this new type of algorithm, we think, naturally opens up a series of interesting questions. What is the consequence of adoption of these algorithms on price levels? What type of strategies these algorithms are autonomously learning, whether they learn to compete or they learn to collude? And what about the effects of having limited observability and uncertainty in market? And of course, if these algorithms are able to learn to collude, what is the appropriate policy to deal with this outcome? So there is a lively cross-disciplinary debate that was going on at least 5 years now. Some academics were worried about the risk of collusion of algorithms. Some others were skeptical. And the idea here is that probably it's easier to learn to compete rather than to collude. Certainly, many policymakers took note on both sides of the Atlantic, and what is probably more interesting nowadays, recently, that some policymakers may also be ready to act with this on this topic. For example, FTC has issued a guidelines on artificial intelligence and pricing, and the so-called new competition tool that was announced by European Commission this spring is also expected to address algorithmic-based technological solutions that may induce collusion. So the point I want to make here is that, in fact, there was a lot of conjecturing about the consequences of algorithms, and but not so much in terms of analysis. And we decided to dig a little bit into this reality. Now, if you want to do this type of analysis, then and the idea would be just to study the outcome of repeated oligopoly interaction when pricing is delegated to AI-powered algorithms. Then you have the typical three approaches in the economist toolbox. You can think about addressing the issue with a theoretical analysis. Here, the difficulty is that if you want to be precise in the functioning of the algorithm, the model becomes quickly highly intractable. You can rely on empirical analysis. This is hard because we have little data so far, even though I will mention there are new papers coming out precisely on this. And so the third option was experimenting, and this is what we have done. So our research agenda has been the following. So we coded AI pricing agents, and we trained them in a synthetic environment, in a standard oligopoly setting. And they were interacting with each other, with clones of themselves. And so the contribution of this experimental approach is probably the most interesting thing is the ability to document with some details the strategies that these algorithms are able to autonomously learn. Now, there are challenges in this approach that we have taken. First of all, the algorithms must be similar to those that are actually used in markets. And second, the underlying environment that we are going to use in our synthetic oligopoly must be sufficiently realistic. So let me just give you in few words the result of this research. We observed that simple AI-powered algorithm systematically, that is in a stubborn way, they learn sophisticated collusive strategies in rich oligopoly environments. That's if you want to just shut down your connection, this is what our research is currently showing. So let me spend a few words on the literature. Of course, we are talking very much to the very large economic literature on learning in game. Remember, our algorithms are automata, can be seen as independent agent that through the activity in the market, they learn how to behave. Of course, in the interest of time, I will not be able to enter into the details and the connections with this literature and the connections that are also interesting with the evolutionary game theory field. Of course, we are also talking about with the computer scientists in a sense, because the computer scientists are researching actively on multi-agent environments. That is what we would call games, essentially, environment strategic interaction. And also statistical physics is interesting in this analysis. But I want to spend a little bit more time on saying that there is an emerging literature nowadays on AI pricing algorithm that is in the hands of economists, written by economists. There are other experiments like the one we have performed. And with respect to this literature, which is important, probably the novelty that we are adding is that we are digging into the strategies with some more details than these other papers. There are theoretical papers, interesting theoretical papers that are somehow facing the difficulty to some extent, which the challenge I was mentioning before, with theoretical papers approach, you need to simplify the description of the algorithms in order to keep track of what is happening in a theoretical model. And there are also empirical papers, very recent empirical paper. Let me mention this paper by Assad and co-authors. They are using price at the retail gasoline market in Germany, and they are identifying the adoption of algorithms. And after the adoption of the algorithms, they are able to show some outcomes of the adoption that are quite consistent with analysis that we, with the results that we obtained with our simulations. So let me go into the building block of our analysis. I will lay down the baseline economic environment that is going to be underlying our investigation. It's going to be an indefinitely repeated game. In the baseline environment, which is simple, there will be just two firms, that is, two algorithms that are pricing for these firms. These two firms are selling differentiated goods. We're going to represent preference of consumers with logic demand. They're going to be constant marginal cost. The environment is going to be symmetric and deterministic, and prices are perfectly observable. So each pricing agent, what we will do, we'll have to repeatedly set the price of its product at any point in time, with the aim to maximize the sum of discounted profit of its own firm. Now, what type of algorithms are we using? Now, the library in artificial intelligence is huge. And we have chosen one algorithm, which is called reinforcement co-learning algorithm, for a series of reasons that I'm going to discuss in a moment. But before that, let me give you, in a nutshell, what is more or less how this algorithm function. So the idea is to store the present value of using a given price P when the market is in a state S into some function, this object that you see here, Q, P, and S. And then at any point in time, T, the algorithm performs these two tasks. The first task is to set the price. And this is done in the following way. With a probability epsilon, the algorithm uniformly randomizes across prices. So it chooses prices by randomization. And this is an exploration activity of the algorithm. With a complementary probability, the algorithm instead will choose the price by simply optimizing, which means it will choose the price that gives the maximal value given the information that the algorithm has at time t and given the state S. Then at the end of the period, the algorithm will, here we go. The algorithm at time t, will observe the realized profit for its firm by t and the new state S prime. And then we'll perform the updating, that is the learning phase, the updating of this Q function, which is taking through this equation that you see here. So the new value of using price P in state S is actually a convex combination of what the algorithm knew before at the beginning of the period and what the algorithm has learned, that is the realization of the profits, and the value from tomorrow onward, given that the environment, the market has moved to a new state S prime. Now, let me go into a little bit more, a couple of more details of the implementation of the algorithms. So this exploration probability that is used to set the price. So computer science literature uses different approach for this exploration probability. What you see here is one possibility that we have used extensively in our simulation. It's called epsilon greedy. So the probability of exploration decays over time exponentially according to this parameter beta, which is called experimentation rate. Another piece of implementation is what is this state? Well, in this simple environment, the state is going to be just the price that the algorithms have observed for the previous period. So in fact, we are endowing our algorithms with one period memory. And the last piece of implementation is going to be the following: discretize the price range, and in this baseline environment with just 15 prices. And the lowest price is going to be below the competitive Bertrand-Nash price, and the highest possible price is going to be above the monopolist price. And then we use what is called in the computer science literature, this independent learning. The independent learning simply means that from the point of view, of, let's say, of algorithm 1, the fact that there is another algorithm is totally irrelevant. The other algorithm just shows up in the fact that there is a state variable component that is what is actually chosen by the other algorithm. So the other algorithm is in fact just a piece of the environment. So this is a challenging environment for algorithms because it involves interaction. The other algorithm, through its own experimentation, is a source of noise, which may make the learning more difficult. In principle, if you look at the literature on computer science that uses this algorithm, there is no guarantee of convergence to optimal policy. Still, the reason why we use these Q-learning algorithms is the following. There are multiple reasons. First of all, these algorithms are model-free. As you have seen, we say nothing to the algorithms about the underlying economic environment. They just observe period after period the realization of their own profit. It's not fancy as an algorithm because it's essentially controlled, let's say, by just two parameters, the learning rate alpha and the rate of experimentation beta, plus the initialization of this Q function at date 0, but that's more a detail. a third reason to use this algorithm is that it's known in the computer science literature, they have theoretical results that with single agent, these algorithms converge to the optimal policy. So they are able to, by iterative estimation, reach the optimal policy. This result is not available in the case of multi-agent though. It's popular, probably some of the most famous algorithms that are based on deep learning are actually using at the core our Q-learning algorithms. And probably also it seems that Scienze is actually using for pricing of gasoline an algorithm that belongs to the same class of Q-learning. And it's also successful in game. You may have heard about the success of these people at DeepMind, which is a branch of Google, showing that with AlphaGo, they were able to beat the champion, the human champion of the game of Go. Well, the core of the algorithm that they use is based on Q-learning. So let me say a few words on the experiment that we're going to use. We're going to consider a large grid of parameters, these two key parameters, the experimentation rate and the learning rate. We will let agents play for a very long number of iterations, possibly up to 1 billion. And we repeat these sessions 1,000 times for each parameterization. So we can look at average results and standard deviations. So what we do essentially, we let algorithms repeatedly interact, and initially there will be a lot of noise, randomness, because they will start with a lot of experimentation. And if and when their behavior will stop changing, so we have proper tests for this, at that point, we take a picture of the prices they are using and the strategies they have learned. So what I'm going to show you next is a snapshot of those picture actions, actually. So results, so I will be brief on the first two types of results. We show that almost always algorithms converge, and even if it's an environment of, let's say, strategic interaction. We observe a lot of equilibrium play, that is, algorithms best respond, most of the time, best respond to each other. But I want to focus on the last three results. They learn to cooperate, that is, they learn to charge high prices. They learn collusive, sophisticated strategies, and this learning is robust. So I want to focus on these three results. What about high prices? This is the typical price distribution that you would observe for a given configuration of the two parameters of the algorithm, alpha and beta. And you see that the pricing is well above the static Nash competitive price. There is a price variability, price dispersion. Prices are rarely the monopolist price, but certainly way above the competitive price. Another measure of high prices is looking to profits. So we have defined this variable profit gain, this delta, which is a variable that values 0 if algorithms are using competitive prices. And it values 1 if algorithms are behaving perfectly like a monopolist. Now, in this heat map that you see here, you have different, for the outcome, the value of this profit gain for different values of the learning rate alpha and the experimentation rate alpha. Now, don't get fooled by the colors here. The minimal number that you see here is above 0.6. And without really any cherry picking, it's really easy to end up with something like 0.85 or close to 0.9, which is quite close to the monopolist outcome. Now, how these super competitive prices are supported? Well, there are two options. Either these algorithms have learned nothing, in a sense they have not learned to compete, for example. This is not a big deal because if this is the case, then they will be washed out of the market quickly. The alternative is that they have instead learned to collude. And if this is the case, we think then the story becomes much more interesting. Now, for the difficulty to answer this question is that to answer this question, you have to dig into the strategies, but strategies are complex objects. So I don't want to enter into the details. This is a graphical representation of a pair of strategies of two algorithms that have learned together. So the punchline is that strategies are difficult objects to analyze because the state space is large and for several reasons. Now, what we have done is, in fact, using a simple economic tools, which we call impulse response of prices. So we have done the following exercise that has the aim to check the important for us as economists behavior that this algorithm may have learned. So what you see here is two algorithms, the red and the blue guy, and the price that they have learned to charge by repeatedly interacting with each other. So you see it's a price which is well above the competitive price, which is the bottom line here, and to some extent below the monopoly's price here. So this is what they've learned to do. And what you have here in the gray area is a shock that we induce. That is, we force one of the two algorithms, in this case, the red one, to cut its price. And then what we do with this impulse response analysis, after that, we record the behavior of the other algorithm, the blue one, and also of the red algorithm that we, just from one period, force to this low price. Now, what you see is to some extent clear to economists. The blue algorithm is taken by surprise at the moment of the shock, is still charging this price. But the moment he realizes that the red algorithm has, let's say, deviates, then he drops his prices. So this is a punishment. Then they stay at low price for some period of time, and then they go back, they revert to pre-shock price. So what is this? Well, this can be interpreted in terms of a reward. I charge high price as long as you charge high price. Punishment, I drop the price as soon as I see you dropping the price. And then forgiveness, after some time we go back, we revert back to high prices. Now, if you look at profits, the effect on profits, well, is as expected. The deviator gets an immediate gain, but then the punishment of the other algorithm drops the profit of the deviator, and then the profits stay low for some periods, and then they go back. Now, if we, and it's something that we do in our analysis, if you evaluate the gain, contrast this gain with these losses, the deviations are always unprofitable. So we are looking here to incentive compatible collusion. Now, these results are robust throughout many different extensions of the models. Now, I will have no time to go into all these extensions that we have performed, and we have them in the papers. Let me just mention one interesting fact. As economists, our models tell us how economic variable would affect the ability of firms to collude. And interestingly enough, these algorithms respond to changing this in terms of these economic variables precisely as economic theory would tell us. Okay, so for example, with a symmetric demand or cost, we know that collusion tends to be more difficult, and in fact, the profit gain of these guys or this algorithm tends to be lower. Collusion is more difficult the more firms are around in the market, and this is also the case for algorithms. So profit gain and prices still remain significantly higher than the competitive, but the more firm in the market, the lower the profit and the prices they're able to get. Now, the last more or less 10 minutes of my time, I want to spend on some more recent results that we are working on. And these are about stochastic cost and private information. Now, what about if these algorithms face costs that are subject to some shocks that are, in addition, privately observed? So this would be a very similar environment to the series of paper, for example, by A.T. and Bagwell. Now, in this environment, collusion is hard. It's hard because a cost reduction naturally calls for a price reduction. But then, since the cost reduction is private information of a given firm, the price reduction can be interpreted by the other firm as a deviation. Okay, so what do we get in this new environment? Now, the environment is going to be essentially the baseline environment I've shown you before, except that now these algorithms may face cost on shock. So there can be low cost or high cost with some probability, 0.5 in the simulation I'm going to show you. Correlation, there is a positive correlation also across algorithms, across firms. And there is a strong persistence. So again, in the simulation I'm going to show you, we use strong persistence, which we think it's in a sense making life of these guys for collusion even harder, because with strong persistent algorithms may learn how to behave when they face a given cost configuration, but then suddenly the cost configuration changes, and then this may really disrupt what they've learned. Now notice that since algorithms now privately know their own cost, the state is algorithm specific. So the state that is relevant for algorithm I now contains the past period prices and the current cost that its algorithm is facing. Now, what about prices? Well, here you see the distribution of prices. Now you see 4 distributions because there are 4 possible configuration of cost: high, high, low, low, and high, low, and low, high. Okay. But you see the story is similar. There is variability, but certainly prices are tend to be quite above the competitive price. Now, we also perform the impulse response analysis in order to check the key behavior that I was showing you before. And this is very similar to the baseline. In terms of price, the red guy deviates here, the blue guy responds with the punishment, and then they go back. What you see here is actually an average across the 4 cost configuration I was mentioned before. And this reflects naturally also in profit. Immediate gain, but then punishment, and the punishment makes the deviation unprofitable. Now, if you look at the impulse responses, they are also there if you break up in terms of different cost configuration. For example, look at this graph here. It's a case in which the 2 algorithms, they both have high costs, so they price initially high price. Then we force the red algorithm to drop its price. The blue one again punishes. And then they go back gradually to pre-shock. Same story when they have low costs. You see that they charge relatively lower price than before, but the story is similar. And also in these mixed configurations in which, for example, here, the red guy, the one that we shock, has a low cost and as a consequence charges a lower price pre-deviation than the blue guy. But still, when we force this red guy to deviate, the blue one punishes, and then they go back. They go back to prices that now are different because the cost configuration, remember in this figure, is different. The red one has a low cost and the blue one has a high cost. Now, what we think is probably, though, the most interesting analysis is what happens to cost changes. Because remember, the difficulty here with private information on stochastic cost is that when an algorithm experiences a change in cost, it will adapt its price. But this adaptation of the price can be interpreted by the other algorithm as a deviation. So what is the behavior of this algorithm? Now, look at this first graph. Remember, this is a configuration where the 2 algorithms start with a high cost both. So they charge this high price here. Now, what you see here, the drop of the red algorithm now is not a deviation. It's simply the fact that in this graph, the algorithm now experiences a lower cost. And as I was saying before, lower cost calls naturally for a reduction in price. And in fact, the red algorithm drops its price. Now, the problem is that this price change is punished by the blue guy. You see the drop of the blue guy. Then they stay low for a few periods, but then, this is important, they, thanks to forgiveness, they go back to higher prices. Now, they go back to price levels that you see here are different. Why? But simply because here, these two algorithms have entered into a new environment due to this cost change, where the red algorithm now has a low cost and the blue algorithm has a high cost. That's why they don't reach the same price level. But what is important is that after, to some extent, what you can interpret as a price war, they are able to increase prices back. And also a similar story in this case here. This is a case in which the two algorithms start here having low cost both. Then it happens that the red algorithm faces now a high cost shock. So if you look at the red algorithm, slightly starts increasing its price. And as soon as the blue algorithm realizes this price change, it punishes. It punishes also this increase in price change. But then, again, what is important is that they, in a sense, forgive and give up with this price war, and they are able to increase prices back, again, to some price level that are asymmetric, because, again, this becomes, in this example, an asymmetric cost configuration, where the red algorithm has a low cost now, and the blue algorithm has a low cost, and the red algorithm has a high cost. Now, what is interesting to notice is that these price wars that are generated by cost changes clearly leave profit on the table. You see, for example, when they start both having high cost, this case here, and the red one faces now a lower cost so that it can drop price and increase its profit here. So you see that the profit in the first period is going to be lower than the long run profit that these two algorithms can get. And similarly, also in this picture here. But if you think about these, in a sense, wasted profits due to these price war engaged by cost reduction in the end, this makes perfect sense. First, it's temporary, it's just temporary. And second, these punishments that are generated simply by cost shocks are needed by the two algorithms to control genuine deviations, deviations that is changing in price that are not generated by changing in cost, but rather by decision to change, deliberate decision to change price. Now, something that we are currently doing is the following. Of course, in this environment with private information and stochastic shock, it may be very useful to have the ability to communicate, to tell the other algorithm, look, I'm going to change my price, not because I want to deviate, but simply because I'm facing a cost shock. Now, the question is, can algorithms learn at least rudimentary communication? This is something that we are exploring. We are adding, and the way we do it is the following. We are adding to the algorithm choice variables a payoff irrelevant but publicly observable variable, like similar to a chip talk. So they can show a red or a white flag, which can be useful in principle to announce, to signal the other algorithm the reason why there's going to be a price change. And I can't comment on the results yet because we are still working on this. What is interesting also to note is that to some extent this idea of communication with algorithms is currently at the frontier of computer science. They are studying whether algorithms can autonomously learn to communicate. Actually, they're doing much more than that. They're studying whether algorithms are able to learn languages from scratch, which is even more than just learning to communicate. And then something that we are working is in more complicated environments with, for example, imperfect public monitoring and what is probably the most complicated environment, which is imperfect private monitoring. So let me spend the last few seconds that I have with a word on competition policy. So suppose nowadays algorithmic collusion is detected. What happens? Well, the current legal doctrine is currently rooted on conspiracy, and the legal standard, for good reasons, is that we need hard evidence to convict managers. And so tacit collusion by algorithms would be perfectly legal in most of the countries nowadays. And I was saying for good reasons. Before the advent of algorithms, when collusion is in the hand of humans, we know that collusion is quite difficult to set up. And so in order to balance, so this legal standard that we have nowadays, it's an appropriate balance of the two errors, false positive and false negative. Now, what we think is that this standard may be, probably could be changed or reconsidered when we now start realizing that markets are populated by autonomous algorithms. And according to our research, with all the limitation of the type of analysis that we have performed, these algorithms show this stubborn ability to learn colluding. If you want to know more about this, I'm gonna refer to this working paper on policy that we have. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. We have, this was very interesting. It's a very hot topic, and that, as you know, in competition law, and very interesting. We have 3 open questions, and I'd like to add one. So this will challenge your ability to respond to questions in a really streamlined way. The first one is from Xavier Vives, and he asks, what is the relationship to Axelrod results on tit-for-tat strategies supporting collusion?
Can I go straight for that? So
Yep.
The difference is that the algorithms that we are using, they are learning. In that case, it was a contest where algorithms were coded to behave in a given ways. So there were populations of different types of algorithms interacting, and the contest was picking the type of algorithm that was winning. So in a sense, it's the difference between expert system, the old type of algorithms, and the AI-powered algorithms.
Understood. The second question is from David Genisovi, which is, would you expect human actors to act differently from these algorithms?
That's a very interesting question. Well, to some extent, they're not so different, no? Because the impulse response that I was showing you before is exactly what we teach to our undergrad students when we talk about collusion. Probably the difference here is that here collusion is systematic, at least to our analysis, it's systematic.
Understood. The third question is from Georgios Stamatopoulos. Do you think you would get similar results within other models, for instance, a Cournot model?
That's another very good question. We have worked on the Cournot model as well, and we get very similar results. So yes. So in fact, the referees did a great job in forcing us moving the robustness check in so many directions that I'm confident that we did quite a bit of the job there. Okay,
and if I can abuse my role as moderator and add one last question, if I understand correctly, all your algorithms are clone of each other. Have you tried to experiment with different algorithms, some using Q-learning, some using different learning, just to replicate what might be an environment in which different firms use different algorithms?
That's a fair, very important question. The answer is no, but it is important to do. What we have done here, we have put together algorithms in the class of Q-learning with different properties, with different parameters in terms of experimentation and in terms of learning. learning rate, and the results are still there. But this is certainly something to explore in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to your time very precisely. As I said, that this was very, very interesting. We now, however, move to, so first of all, thank you very much, Giacomo. But now we move to our second speaker, that is Loius Kaplow. Loius is a Finn M.W. Caspersen and Household International Professor of Law Economics at Harvard Law School, and is also Associate Director of the John M. Olin Center for Law Economics and Business. Loius' research in competition law is way too long to summarize, but it includes at least 3 very important books, or I would say antitrust analysis, fairness and welfare, and competition policy and price fixing. However, today, Loius will talk about horizontal merger analysis. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I wish I were in Italy, and I wish I were seeing both those who've been so kind as to stay on this kind of a presentation in the middle of a Sunday or at the end of a Sunday, depending on the time zone. And thanks to the organizers. And also thanks, Giacomo, for your presentation, which was fascinating and got me awake, alert, and sharp to get ready to go for mine, and really kept me on edge. And I had a lot of questions too. That was great. So the talk today is on horizontal merger analysis. This is less in the form of a paper and more a lecture. As indicated at the bottom of this slide, this grows out of an under construction book project and a series of articles. And basically, I want to do 3 things with this project and today. Number 1, I want to shake things up and raise a lot of questions. Number 2, I want to start answering some of them and make some progress. And number 3, I want to identify a number of research topics where, because of number 1, I think we know less than we think we know. And hopefully number 3, the ones I haven't made progress on, or have only made some progress on, or have made defective progress on, others will jump in, fill the gap, and move things forward. So that's the general goal today. To elaborate this a little bit, much competition regulation involves horizontal mergers. It's obviously a centerpiece, affects major industries. There's a lot of work going around in the last 3-4 years, controversial work on rising concentration across sectors of the economy, across different economies, market power, how much do mergers contribute? There's concerns about big pharma and tech acquisitions of nascent challengers. So there's a lot of foment and attention to what we already knew was an important topic. My sense as a competition policy person is that among the different areas of competition policy, this is one that on the policy side is considered relatively solid. Note the word relatively, compared to, say, unilateral behavior and some other things. Merger guidelines actually exist and have substantially converged for decades now throughout much of the world. Economic methodologies are state-of-the-art relative to those for, say, detecting collusion or doing various other things. And we have significant literatures. We have modeling, we have calibrated simulations, we have retrospectives on mergers. However, a lot of the key foundations are actually known to be shaky. We sort of don't talk about them, but every now and then an ordinary person like me at an IO conference will say, well, but don't we know that market definition that's at the core of the guidelines is kind of a mess? And people have started paying more attention to, like, all of our guidelines have HHI levels as a central policy diagnostic, but we kind of also know they're not in any of our models. Like, is it a problem that our policy guide and our models have like a 0 intersect in a major area? Do our methodologies actually predict well? We're not so sure. And just to take one example from many, we both have a general consensus that purported efficiencies justify allowing most mergers without much scrutiny. And it's also said in agencies and in US courts that we don't actually analyze efficiencies in any depth very often, and they almost never decide cases. So they're ubiquitously important, but we almost never analyze them. So that's sort of at a general level, and that we already know that we should be a little bit more uneasy than we might profess. But there are also a lot of unaddressed or only recently and emergingly addressed questions. The rationality constraint, which is at the center of a lot of our models, is just missing in a lot of merger analysis. It's not in agency guidelines. It's not in the ordinary compete battles of experts as to what's going on in any very direct way. Coordinated effects, which we just heard about, are a traditional concern of merger policy, but now have been almost forgotten in merger policy, in part because they're hard to analyze. Efficiencies, I've already mentioned some queasiness, but just to give a little bit more, every merger guideline in the world that I'm aware of says efficiencies only count if they're merger specific. If you can achieve them without the merger, how can they justify a merger? Well, what the heck does merger specific mean? It means that you can't do it by contract. Well, what is it that you can do in the firm, but you cannot do by contract? We have like all these Nobel Prizes for theory of the firm. We have fields of organizational economics. They are completely missing in action in competition policy. And those fields themselves ignore merger efficiencies in the horizontal merger context in particular. So we have Nobel Prizes for work, but we have no connection of that to the relevant space for competition policy. Entry is central to the functioning of a market economy. We don't teach a couple weeks of basic economics without talking about resources moving to highest value uses, demand shifts, technology changes that causes entry and exit. These are not, entry is not a detail. It's at the core of how an economy works. But we talk about entry preventing post-merger price increases. More recent work raises the question in older work, but really does it? And there's also a question ignored in merger policy, which is if we have a merger that induces entry, we have a lot of other models that tell us that that may be inefficient. And actually in some models, it will make the welfare effects of the merger worse than if the entry didn't occur. But that's not in any of our analysis. Merger analysis focuses on single sectors. In fact, almost all IO analysis focuses on single sectors. But what are this minor detail that we have distortions in all sectors or most sectors of the economy? We use an outside good in our models in an empirical analysis, and the outside good is implicitly the rest of the economy where price equals marginal cost. But that's not the actual economy. This is not a small detail. And then finally, almost all of merger regulation is short-run analysis, but we know we care about long-run welfare. So these are some rather major sets of questions that I think have been underattended to. Not unattended to, but underattended to. So here's the basic orientation of my project. Ask all the basic questions, even if we act as if we already know the answers, because maybe we don't have them or maybe our answers aren't so good. Ask the questions even if we can't answer them. And then if they can't be answered, or if the answers are too hard for agencies and courts, we should still ask them, we should still do research. And part of the reason is to be able to answer them in the future. And part of the reason is if we are going to use proxies, shortcuts, screens, presumptions, rules of thumb, they should at least be a plausible approximation of what we think is the correct analysis, even if we can't do the correct analysis in every case because it's too hard. They should be grounded in something that makes sense, which many of them currently are not now. So here's an outline of much of the project and much of today's talk. I'm going to just skip over merger law and policy on the theory that 2/3 of the people or more on this particular session probably already know a lot of those basics. So let me talk about some foundations, which are elementary, but which have some pretty important implications. So we normally use a decision analytic framing, which is, I'll say on the next slide, we know is not really correct, where we compare the expected anti-competitive costs of a merger to the expected efficiency benefits of allowing the merger. What we do is we have priors, and then we take the evidence, form a likelihood ratio, and update our priors. That's what we imagine ourselves to be doing. In doing this, we should in principle be paying attention to the individual rationality constraints. Ordinarily, the implicit model, sometimes the explicit model, is there are two hypotheses, two reasons why the firms might be merging, not necessarily mutually exclusive. One is profit from anti-competitive gains, and one is profit from efficiencies. And there could be others, and I will in the project be perhaps addressing these and might be writing about it later, but haven't yet gone into it too deeply. So what are the implications for inference? Well, the standard agency protocol, and what I'm told by many people in agencies, the way a lot of the work is actually done, is what I would call sequential siloing. We look at anti-competitive effects. If there is sufficient concern, we then look at efficiencies. Well, that's just incoherent. If you want to know which side of a scale is heavier, the notion that you can concentrate on one side of the scale and make a preliminary decision without looking at the other defies common sense. It also runs into real problems if you're an economist or a statistical decision theorist, because how do you update your prior? You use a likelihood ratio. A likelihood ratio is the ratio of the likelihood you'd see the evidence given one hypothesis, say anti-competitive, to the likelihood you'd see the evidence with the other hypothesis, efficiencies. How do we form a likelihood ratio with no denominator? We've been purporting to do this. Agencies and economists have been purporting to do it. Experts give testimony purporting to do it, but it's not something that is possible to do. Also, much of our specific evidence bears on everything. So partly pulling off of the talk we just had, the cost function is relevant to competitive interaction, it's relevant to entry, it's relevant to efficiencies. So how we compare a dispute on what we think the cost function is, looking only at its implications for anti-competitive effects and not for other things, really doesn't make a lot of sense. There are additional issues. So there are some ex-ante mechanism design questions that there are older literatures and some recent literature that's finally coming back to about the effects of merger policy on ex-ante entry investment and things like this. There's also, as I alluded to on my motivation slide, what I'll call multi-market effects. Almost a century ago, Abba Lerner in a famous article, followed by a very famous article on general theory of second best by Lipsy and Lancaster, was talking about the fact that we have distortions in multiple sectors, so we really need to be careful about sector-specific policy. This has essentially been ignored, except in a small strand of the international trade literature in modern industrial organization economics. But think about it. Let's say the price in every sector was elevated 25% above marginal cost. What would be the allocative inefficiency from that? As Lerner stated in 1934, 0. And then we can ask questions like, do we believe in the outside good, or do we believe in general equilibrium analysis and that resources flow between sectors and move prices? So even if you can't analyze a merger case in an agency doing a full general equilibrium model of the economy, I'm not advocating that we get there anytime soon. We do, for formulating policy, need to think about general equilibrium. So for example, when prices go up in a high markup sector, that tends to increase total distortion in the economy. When prices go up in a low markup sector, that tends to reduce inefficiency in the economy. So just in thinking of first order policy, this has pretty important implications. Well, I will move from those general and framework comments to the core of anti-competitive effects analysis and modern merger policy. As some of you know, I've written many would say too many previous papers attacking market definition, and I will be talking about that from a slightly different and new angle today. But let me just sort of begin. So as many of you know, the standard merger guidelines approach first defines a market before it looks at market shares. The modern machinery is called the hypothetical monopolist test, and I will talk about it occasionally for concreteness, but there's some method by which, is it a narrow market, is it a broad market? Because if we're going to look at market shares, we kind of need to know the market, and then we have a debate about what's the right market. We have some problems. So as many people have pointed out, this notion of market redefinition, although one can write down the hypothetical monopoly test as an algorithm, the concept doesn't really exist in industrial organization economics. We have papers like this recent Noki-Winston working paper, which I'm a big fan of, and have talked to them about, that either rationalize or critique, say, the use of the delta HHI in merger guidelines. But they are not using the same delta HHI that the merger guidelines are using. They're using the delta HHI like in a Cournot model in the homogeneous goods market that does not do the hypothetical monopolist test. So the shares they use in their simulations or other papers do are not the shares that the agencies are doing. We have a mismatch here. Now going back to one of my favorite economists, Abba Lerner. I don't know how many people have ever read his 1934 article or reread it recently as I have. His article is famous for the Lerner index. You've heard of the Lerner index, the degree to which price is above marginal cost. Why did Abba Lerner write an article inventing the Lerner index? Because he thought in 1934 that all this talk about market definition and market shares was completely baseless and ridiculous. He mocked it throughout the article and said, we need a sensible way that economists can respect to talk about monopoly power. So let's throw away all this market share, market definition stuff, and instead use my approach. Well, everyone, including IO economists and including competition agencies, talk about the Lerner index, but they ignored the rest of the article that was his motivation for coming up to it. There's this other minor detail, which we're all aware of, which is somewhere around the 1970s, the structure, conduct, performance paradigm collapsed, and it collapsed because market shares are endogenous. So how can we have a machine that takes market shares as inputs? Basically, the guidelines are an analog to a cross-sectional regression and applying market share tests across industries when we don't really believe in this. So these are like really big problems. They're quite foundational. They're not details in engineering implementation or for a particular industry. So let me give you a way to think about what we do now and what we do now, or we claim we do now in competition policy, and how it differs from what we do in IO. So what we do in IO, I would call direct inference. We make an inference about market power, perhaps, and I'm using the word loosely, maybe how much market power would go up from a given merger. And that is some function that we use analysis, models, and empirical evidence. And we say it's some function of what I'll just call all of the evidence. So sigma is just all the information relevant to predicting the price effects in this particular merger. And we've been doing work for decades. Some of it relates back to Cournot or Bertrand over a century to come up with our best estimate of the market power effects of a merger. That's what IO economists do. But what agencies at least claim to do, and economists and agencies claim to do, is they do a market definition. They take this vector of information, and they have some algorithm. In the guidelines, it's the HMT, that defines a market and produces as the output a share vector. And then they take the share vector, and they have a grid that says, well, if the HHI is above 2,000 and the delta HHI is above 250, that's the EU guidelines, then we're in this range, else we're in that range, and so forth. So we can ask just a very simple question. Think of H tilde, the composite function, where we take the market definition and shares that come from the G function, which might be the HMT in the guidelines. And then we take the share grid, which is the F function, and that gives us a composite function, a mapping from our underlying information to some inference. And we can ask, does that equal the true function? And the answer is, not only does it not under the actual guidelines, there exists no way with this process to define an F and G function that even approximately do this across a range of settings. And there certainly exists no way to do it approximately that looks anything like what we do now. So to elaborate this a little bit, let's take the mapping from market shares to market power. One question we can ask, which answers itself, in the parlance of public economists, which is probably spilled over to many of you, we use the language of sufficient statistics. Is a share vector a sufficient statistic for a predicted anti-competitive effect? Answer, not even close. It omits the elasticity, it's going to vary across models of competitive interaction, and a lot more. We can then ask a weaker question. If we have some more complicated formula that tells us predicted anti-competitive effects, and if that formula happens to have market shares in it in some way, are HHI and delta HHI, which is what we normally use, the correct elements in the subset of sufficient statistics that relates to market shares? And the answer, as I'll elaborate on the next slide, is no, not close, and not in any model. Is there any model of redefined markets that is not like the homogeneous goods market for Cournot, but an expanded market when you've added substitutes that gives us a formula that allows us to ever map market shares and elasticities to price effects? And the answer is, I know of none that exists in any paper, any text, any working paper, and no one I've ever asked has ever been able to give me a concrete answer to that question. So we have a pretty large gap. If we then look at the market definition half, the thing that maps our information vector to our market definition in our share vector, we might ask, what the heck is that function? Well, it's highly restrictive because we're throwing away a lot of information and we're asking a share vector to summarize all of this information. There's another question, which is, what is our criteria? So as I've sometimes put to people, the HMT is an algorithm. Going back to Giacomo's language, what is the objective function to which the HMT algorithm is an answer or an approximation? And the short statement is, there is none. You might think our objective function is which market definition, the narrow definition or the broad definition, minimizes error. Error in terms of predicted price effect, predicted consumer welfare loss, predicted deadweight loss, whatever it might be. And the answer is that is not what we do. What if we did do it? Well, even if we had, instead of the HMT, some loss minimizing algorithm that mapped information to shares, we still have the problem that whichever market we choose, say the narrow one or the broad one in a merger case, and that share vector, since it's not close to a sufficient statistic, we're going to throw out information and make error. So the point of these last two slides is, in a deep and very broad way, this entire redefinition HMT process is more than dead on arrival. It really should never have been there. Let me briefly talk about some applications to mergers. So let's start with unilateral homogeneous goods Cournot model, a brief question asked at the end of the last presentation. We do have formulas that involve mappings of shares and elasticity under highly simplified assumptions to price effects. So the Noki and Winston paper has this. It turns out that the HHI is not in that formula at all, that the delta HHI, even in the simplest model, is not the right subset of sufficient statistics for the shares of the two firms. The HMT and the grids in the US guidelines or the European Union guidelines, they're not a little bit off. I just do a simple algebraic example in the most naive calculation possible, plain vanilla, and we have an error larger than 35 to 1. What do I mean by that? I mean the most plain vanilla case that under the HMT, you stick with the narrow market and you plug those shares into the Cournot model and ask what is the price increase from the merger that is presumptively challenged in the United States. The answer is that price increase is smaller than 1/35th the price increase of another simple example that under the HMT test, you get a broad market in a presumptively safe harbor merger. So we have a safe harbor merger, plain vanilla, with more than 35x the price increase of a presumptively challenged merger. Those are the sizes of the errors we're making under the current approach. So it's not just that it's theoretically bankrupt, that you just take the plain vanilla case, run the numbers, and you get a complete mess. I don't think anyone's actually run the numbers and asked whether what we're doing now makes much sense. Unilateral effects Bertrand's, everybody knows the right analysis to figure out the price effects. Everyone knows there's no market definition, there's no HHI, there's no delta HHI. Coordinated effects, harder to analyze, but also we don't get any of these results. And by the way, and this relates to something that was in Giacomo's presentation conveniently, we know by lore, it's not necessarily true. The algorithms may be better than people, and that relates to one of the questions he was asked. But we know that by lore, at least, we think it's often easier to collude with multiple firms when they're more symmetric. We have a less binding IRC. There are other reasons, common discount rates help. They can collude to a higher price. Well, if you just think about it for a second, hold the number of firms constant. What happens when you have a higher HHI? When you have a higher HHI, that means the firms are more asymmetric. So the only time that HHI might matter for coordinated effects, it has the wrong sign. For most other factors, it doesn't seem to matter at all. So that's like we have complete loser, worse loser, and even worse loser as to how it performs. Here's an EARIE in the US guidelines, and it's really easy to do with modern high-tech methods, way fancier than anything Giacomo was showing you. I did an electronic search on the US guidelines for HHI. I got 20 hits. The first 19 were in the market definition, market share, presumptive challenge section. In the entire 3 sections on how do we analyze competitive effects, 1 hit, 1 out of 20. And guess what it said? It said, we don't use the HHI for this. So here we have the whole machinery, all this talk about HHIs. It's only mentioned once in the analysis section to say, of course, it's irrelevant here, and we would not want to be looking at it. So that is our current machinery, and that's what the 2010 US guidelines say about it. Let me move to a couple more topics, and here I'm going to raise some trouble again and give some partial answers. So efficiencies, in my motivation slide, think about it. Why would we not just prohibit essentially every horizontal merger or require full conditions and spin-offs to eliminate all horizontal overlap? Aside from some administrative cost and convenience, for any that are even slightly large, it's because we think there might be efficiency trade-offs. And we don't want to completely mess with the ability of firms to reorganize operations in different ways to achieve efficiencies. So the ubiquity of efficiencies, or at least the perceived or believed or alleged ubiquity of efficiencies, is thought to justify most mergers. But we almost never analyze them. So either we have high anti-competitive effects and we say, oh, the efficiencies couldn't be larger. Or we have low anti-competitive effects and we say the efficiencies must be larger. Ask yourself this question. All mergers come from a joint distribution of anti-competitive effects and efficiencies. It's a little more subtle because the rationality constraint means all mergers come from a self-selection, so a conditional on the joint distribution of underlying efficiencies and anti-competitive effects. So think about the correct joint distribution and ask what is the likelihood that like efficiencies and anti-competitive effects are each like bimodal, negatively correlated, and they're almost never approximately the same. Like, could that possibly be so? And the answer is not even close. So we can't, it's impossible to imagine models of the economy that would give us anything like what we're currently spitting out. So we think there are various types of efficiencies, and of course the hard part is how do we analyze them? So I want to focus in, as my motivation slide suggested, on merger specificity. So merger specificity refers familiarly to the requirement in all guidelines that for an efficiency to count, the merger must be really a necessary, if that's what it's focusing on, but also sufficient condition to generate the efficiency. Otherwise, don't allow the merger, prevent the anti-competitive effects, and let them go off and obtain the efficiency some other way. We have our cake and eat it too. Makes complete sense. I have no objection. The first thing that's been missed in almost all analysis of mergers for at least 50 or 60 years is that the same logic applies to anti-competitive effects. We have to ask what anti-competitive effects would happen without the merger. And I'm going to give you a superficial, simple analysis. And my paper on this that's going to be coming out soon, and in my book there'll be more, but just to whet your appetite. Think about the common argument. Economies of scale do not justify a merger, because if there really are economies of scale, firms will do it by internal growth. Well, let's say we have 10 firms in an industry, all symmetric, and a new technology says that there should only be 5 because minimum efficient scale just went up from 10% to 20%. You could allow the 10 to merge to 5, or you could allow the 10 to do internal growth. But what's going to happen when the 10 do internal growth? 5 of them will double and 5 of them will exit, and we'll end up with 5 firms. So why is it that preventing those mergers helps avoid the anti-competitive effect? No one's ever really said. Now, I think there are reasons to prevent those mergers relating to option value and uncertainty, but let's just say we need a lot more analysis. The bigger one is common alternatives to merger are contracts. Contracts have agency problems. How do you avoid agency problems in contracts? One common way is you align incentives. What happens when you align incentives? You soften competition. So the real question is there a contractual alternative to merger that can get the efficiency, can align incentives, but not also soften competition? Well, we can align the incentives halfway. Maybe we then get half the efficiencies and half the anti-competitive effects. Is that better or is that worse? Again, the fuller analysis that'll be in the paper is not that we should allow all mergers. None of my analysis strongly systematically points toward like more relaxed merger regimes or tighter. It's just how do we think straight? To think straight, we have to be looking at the nexus or interaction between efficiencies and anti-competitive effects in various alternatives. My next point was on the motivation slide. What about the theory of the firm? So I have a colleague, Oliver Hart. We've been running a workshop together for 30 years. I've heard like almost every theory of the firm paper the last 30 years presented in this workshop. And what I've noticed is I've never heard any of those papers talked about in an IO workshop or talked about in writing about merger efficiencies or anything else. So we have efficiencies. You can do it inside the firm. You cannot do it nearly so well by contract. Ever since Coase's famous paper on theory of the firm, this has been a big research question. Jensen and Meckling famously wrote, a firm is just a nexus of contracts. It's a bundle of contracts. That means it's semantically impossible to be able to do something in a firm you can't do by contracts. We must be talking about different kinds of contracts. Well, what are we talking about there? Well, there are these fields called organizational economics that Herbert Simon was one of the founders of. We have a lot of work from Williamson in transaction cost economics that sometimes is in IO. We have Hart and Moore and others who've written about this. And basically, what we have now in terms of research communities are two ships passing in the night. The theory of the firm, organizational economics people do now talk about efficiencies in horizontal mergers. The IO and other people who do competition policy don't talk about and engage with the theory of the firm and organizational economics literature. Just one tweak that I find entertaining. Oliver Williamson wrote the famous paper on efficiency, deadweight loss trade-off in mergers in 1968. Then he won a Nobel Prize for his writing in the 70s and 80s on theory of the firm. He himself never joined the two literatures. So that's kind of interesting. Let me talk a little bit about entry. So traditional analysis of entry in merger policy, in merger guidelines, is we ask, might entry be speedy enough after mergers to prevent the price increase and therefore render the merger not so anti-competitive after all? Couple points. The first is that this justification for mergers is generally false, except in the extreme. Basically, if the entry wasn't profitable pre-merger, the only way it's going to be profitable post-merger is if prices are going up. And if the entry is wiping out all of the price increase, then that entry may not be ex post profitable even after the merger. So this whole story doesn't make a lot of sense. It can make sense. We have integer problems. So it's not that there's nothing to this analysis, but it's been very much oversold. There's a recent paper coming back to some older work with simulations that's helping demonstrate this fairly straightforward, intuitive point. There's a second problem that I alluded to in my motivation slide. If post-merger entry does occur, does that make the merger less harmful or more harmful? Well, it makes the merger less harmful if prices go down, but it makes the merger more harmful, thinking in part of John Asker's lecture earlier today, if the total productivity of the industry because of the entry and the burn of new fixed costs increases the total production costs of the industry. So what I show is in a plain vanilla homogeneous goods case coming off of Mankiw and Winston's analysis in that case, is do the following analysis. Do a marginal merger, so we're taking derivatives here, and do marginal entry. So as you marginally allow more consolidation in prices to go up, you marginally draw in more entrants. Ask what is the welfare effect of the merger if you shut off entry, you don't allow new firms to enter. Compute the welfare effect of the merger, and then relax that constraint and now allow the firms to do profitable free entry in the imperfectly competitive equilibrium. The answer in the homogeneous goods case is welfare goes down from that second step, not up. If you have differentiated products and Dixit-Stiglitz preference, welfare is constant as you allow entry to go in. If you have sufficient contribution to variety or innovation, welfare goes up from the entry. So basically, our plain vanilla analysis of entry and mergers is leaving out the minor detail of the cost of entry and how that affects welfare. This is first order and could be very large. The entry effects from a merger that raised prices can easily be the bulk of the welfare loss from an anti-competitive merger. So what's the real reason why easy entry favors allowing mergers? Well, this has been understood. It's just not in the guidelines and not in a lot of the literature, which is if entry is really easy, the merger will probably not be profitable if the source of profits was price increases. So we have an IRC problem. That basically, if I'm merging and I don't have efficiencies, for me to raise the industry price, I have to reduce my quantity. I produce a positive externality on my competitors. The entrants eat away, let's say, 2/3 of that price increase. But I bore all the cost of the price increase. I only get a small share of the benefit. The entrants just ate up 2/3 of my benefit, but I'm bearing all the cost. So maybe now the merger isn't profitable. So that's a merger the competition agencies won't see from the IRC. So if they're seeing the merger, it's probably true that they have efficiencies if entry is really easy. This is not a deep or complicated argument. This is not unknown in game theory or IO, but this really is the core of what correct entry analysis is about. So in a paper I'm working on, I have some more things about entry. So again, there can be ex-ante entry, entry for buyout. There's this wonderful Eric Rasmussen paper in JIE over 30 years ago that shows that merger-induced entry, ex-ante entry, that is entry for the purpose of being bought out, can be inefficient. And say this more recent Mermelstein et al. Paper is a model. And just think for a second about the statement of the effects of a tough merger policy. For the simulations they run, for many of them, a tough merger policy is good. It raises welfare. Why? Because it discourages entry. Total welfare is higher. Dominant firms earn greater profits in the restrictive merger equilibrium because a tough merger policy substitutes for their commitment to not acquire buyers, and consumer surplus falls. This is just completely different from the normal analysis. Now, there are minor details, like this analysis only holds in a homogeneous goods dominant firm model, and it requires certain assumptions about entry timing and other things. It's not a robust result, but it's a possibility result. And what it stands for is we really need to think a lot more about ex-ante entry. A hot area for ex-ante entry today is that maybe when a big firm buys off a disruptive entrant, that's a major source of inefficiency because we lose the competition going forward. I believe that this is one of the most important areas of merger policy research. I believe that a lot of these acquisitions may be quite bad, but almost all of the current analysis of them is incorrect because it takes the entrant's entry as given. And a lot of the profit for the entrant is from the buyout that we are now contemplating prohibiting. So what you really need is ex-ante incentive analysis of will we still get the disruptive entrant? How will the niche in which the entrant will choose to enter change if you don't allow the dominant firm to acquire it? And then figure out what mergers we do and don't allow. If they're a complement, but they might be a future substitute, do we allow it? Do we not allow it? Again, I'm not saying we're being too strict or too lenient on merger policy in this space. I'm saying if you're concerned about disruptive entrants, half of the concern is the ex post buyout, but the other half of the concern is will they enter and doing what in the first place? Major research question. So since I only have a couple minutes left, given my starting time, I'm going to quickly mention 3 more points. We need priors, we need predictions, and we need presumptions. For priors, we need to know how likely are proposed mergers to be good or bad. And a minor difficulty is we, the IO community as a whole, has contributed very little to this debate in the last 30 years. The biggest contribution to the debate comes from the finance field that studies large data sets on mergers and subsequent performance. There's a lot of problems with that literature. Much of it is not about horizontal mergers. But in my experience, the finance people don't talk to the IO people don't talk to the finance people. There's also industry studies there. I think we've made real progress. So I think in certain industries with repeat mergers, we actually do have priors. Predictions, I will just mention one point. How well do our merger simulations perform? We have the following problem, which I call the 2x2 problem, which is in the literature. Merger simulations, we have a lot of choices as to what structural assumptions to make that we can't test. So if we're a conscientious merger simulator, we get a wide range of predictions. If we're doing retrospectives to test our predictions, we have to pick the comparator firms for the diff and diff analysis. And we know that that's a complete mess of confounds. So in doing the prediction, we have a lot of choices that we can't validate. In doing the validation, we have a lot of choices we can't validate. And then we have to mix those together to see how well we're doing on prediction. That's a pretty serious challenge. The final thing I want to point out goes back to some of my earlier slides, which is on presumptions, which is how the heck do we come up with rules of thumb? And I've got some further things to say, but since time is out, I won't. But basically, we need something a lot better than this HMT machine that uses HHIs and delta HHIs if we want to make predictions. So I will skip my other topics and just put up the conclusion side and subside for questions. I think horizontal merger analysis is much less well developed than appreciated. I think that this is very challenging for legal institutions like agencies and courts, whom I occasionally advise. I think there's a big research agenda for us. That's good, because that means that we have more things that will keep us out of trouble. And I just want to leave with a punchline. The agencies and courts ultimately need things they can actually do in a given case. But if you're going to do this, you can't just pick something that someone arbitrarily made up 40 years ago. You actually need some priors and some analysis to say, okay, we see these regularities. Here are some rules of thumb and some shorthands that maybe are the best we can do for the next 10 years. But in order to pick them sensibly, they really need us. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Lois. We have, I found this fascinating and very useful for me, given that, I do mergers every day, unfortunately. We have one question from the attendees and two for me. The first one is from Gabriel Domingo that says, who says, my reading of your analysis is that not only that the analysis is incomplete or even incorrect, is that his sense is that the complete analysis would tend to lead to a more permissive merger policy. Is that a correct reading of your overall message?
So I would say almost all the arguments and topics I raised, I cannot myself form a hunch as to whether they lead to more or less permissive policies. I think we don't have good priors. I think we don't analyze efficiencies well. I think that my more detailed efficiency analysis, which I did not present, suggests a lot of them are less plausibly benefited by mergers, but there's a narrower set that we haven't crystallized on where mergers might be particularly good ways to achieve those efficiencies. So most of my arguments are about ordering. So when I gave that 35-to-1 illustration, my claim was neither that the one that causes 1/35th the effect we should not be blocking, even though we might be now, nor the one that causes 35 times as much we should be blocking when we're allowing it now. But like, let's get the ordering approximately correct. The one point that might more systematically favor more lenient competition policy, but here I view competition policy now including trade, entry regulation, IP regulation, is the multi-sector general equilibrium point, which IO has not pursued, is, I think, a first order matter, not just for IO, but for other fields as well. So what do you do when you have a lot of distorted sectors? To me, the most important thing you want to do is prioritize, which because of scarce resources, we have to do anyhow. So it relates to the ordering issue as well. So high distortion sectors, even small increases, we know how deadweight loss works. If you're already in the very bad and you even go up a little bit, that's really bad. So maybe we want to be way aggressive in those sectors, way more than we would be otherwise. But targeting sectors that have among the lowest margins in the economy probably will reduce overall welfare. And that's true for all manner of regulation. So in what order do we reform policy? How do we get rid of lots of these distortions? Some of them we can't get rid of. Some of them are not even really properly thought of as distortions because we have to take an ex ante view and look at investment incentives. We know when we do IP, we think that way. But that's, I think, the only point I made that generally has a pointer on it in some sense. I think all the rest do not.
Okay, and that's useful. Also, you know, this would lead to justify somehow the increasing focus of agencies on sector of the economy with very high margin, which is what they're focusing on. My question was, I agree with you entirely that, you know, HHIs and the whole paraphernalia doesn't really give you a good prediction, so it doesn't allow you to make a good prediction, and as a matter of fact, the agencies don't use it that much, perhaps also because of that reason. How do you feel about the new set of, or new, I mean, they're at least 10 years old, if not 20, the set of, or 30, the set of tools that is UPP, GAPI, and those formulas and algorithms to estimate unilateral effects. One argument would be that those do have a relationship to the learner index, or at least to margins, and that they are model agnostic because they come from first order conditions. So do you feel a little bit better about those, or do you think they're open to the same criticisms?
Okay, so I feel much better about those, and I'll just make a couple quick remarks. It's in the more detailed analysis where I'll be saying more. So we have to start by thinking straight. So the notion like, how do we affect how is a merger changing first order incentives and what it's doing? This is what IO economists have been doing, needs to have more. But even within that analysis, I'd say a couple things. For example, I think we relatively pay too much attention to diversion relative to the margins, because we know to do the correct analysis, the margins on the products matter a lot. That requires better skill sets in agencies, which is one of my side interests and relates to efficiencies as well, of industry expertise to better understand costs and marginal costs in firms. The other thing I'd observe, and it's come up in certain areas and it relates to Giacomo's presentation, we've sort of given up on coordinated effects, and we're just assuming the first order condition in the model when we do that. So there's like this Peters paper on the airline industry that says the reason that kind of analysis isn't predicting well is because a lot of the airline mergers made coordination easier, and that was really the first order effect. So it is, even though I'm pushing for rigorous analysis, it's a mistake to say we have better models, analysis, and empirical techniques for unilateral than for coordinated. In areas of the economy where there's reason to believe that coordinated is a first order problem, it can cause much larger price increases than the unilateral. It's a mistake, you know, the metaphor looking where the light is, looking under the lamppost and so forth. There's a really nice article by Schmalensee about 4 years ago that ridicules economists, modern economists, for doing this. And I think to a substantial degree, he's correct. I think that a lot of good work is done, but we need to prioritize in part by importance and not just by tractability. It's sort of the intersect of the two for the research agenda, but the policy people really need to order by importance and not just tractability.
Thank you very much. I think that this concludes the time available to us. It's been very, very interesting and very useful. I think I talk for all the participants, but definitely for me as a practitioner. So all it's left for me to do is to thank you, Luis, and thank you, Giacomo, for your great presentations. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you.
And with that, the session is over. Thank you.